We're going to be getting started soon for the Chairman's Book Club. It's a few minutes after 12. We'll start about 5 after. If everyone could start gathering, I'd appreciate it. Ready? Well, I'm just going to go ahead and get started, and people can wander in and be seated as they will. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Frank Hausch. I have the honor of being the chairman of the Board of Trustees for the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, and we're here today for what I think is the 5th or 6th or something installment of the Chairman's Book Club. The Chairman's Book Club is an idea that I've had that I'm pleased to say has met with some success, which is discussing issues of importance to all of us in the context of books, in the context of recently issued, usually nonfiction books. It began a year or so ago with a discussion of Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me and issues related to race in the United States. We've discussed issues of gender. We have discussed issues of ecology, and more recently, we discussed an interesting book as it related to the issue of science and its interpretation in politics through the book of a book called "The Book That Changed America," the reception of the theory of evolution in the United States. That was our most recent discussion, which have all been extremely fruitful. Today we are here to discuss issues of urbanization and gentrification, and we have a wonderful panel to discuss the book in the context of Richard Florida's The New Urban Crisis. I'm going to introduce them. First we have Rawa, I should have asked before I began, give me the pronunciation of your last name. Rawa Gurmatzian is the Deputy Director of Push Buffalo, the local membership-based community organization that combines green, affordable housing construction, community-based renewable energy projects, housing weatherization, green jobs training, all with the goal of creating pathways to employment for neighborhood residents while reducing our carbon footprint. Born in Eritrea in the middle of a civil war, Rawa came to Western New York at the age of 8 by way of Sudan as a refugee. She was educated in the Buffalo Public Schools and the University of Buffalo. Over the past 15 years, Rawa has worked with community-based organizations throughout Western New York that promote community development across sectors and ensure that alternate voices are heard and encouraged to participate in building a more just, equitable, and civically engaged community. Previously, Rawa served as executive director of Ujima Company, the 39-year-old activist theater company. She's a certified community health worker and founding member of the local think tank Partnership for the Public Good. To her right, to your left, in the center, Keisha Patterson has recently located to Pittsburgh, her hometown, after 21 years in Buffalo. A graduate of Florida A&M University, she came to Buffalo for her master's in architecture from the University of Buffalo. As part of her studies, she had the opportunity to intern with local noted architect Robert Traynham Coles and participate in East Side design projects, including the Apollo Theater Public Access Television Station, the Hamlin Park Historic District, and the Meriwether Library. One of the gems of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library system, I would point out, recently the beneficiary of some public money from the Dormitory Authority. This is just me as the chairman piping in. That community is also served by the East Delavan branch, which I am pleased to say is going to be as the benefit of not just some state and county money, but city money. And if you know the East Delavan branch, you know that it is desperately in need of a rehab, and we finally have the money to do it properly. We are going to be putting in new floors, an elevator. It's going to be great. So I'm a little off topic, but it's very important, and I'm glad to keep talking about that as long as I can. It's only been 30 years that we've been trying to get that done, and it's finally happened. Keisha is passionate about revitalizing cities as a means of promoting economic development, environmental responsibility, social justice, and sustainable growth while retaining cultural and architectural heritage. Finally, last but not least, to my right, to your left, Robert Silverman, professor of in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at UB. He has a BS in Political Science, a Master's in Public Administration from Arizona State, and a PhD in Urban Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where I was last week. Off topic again, but quite true nonetheless. I went to a Bucks game. They're good this year. His research focuses on fair and affordable housing, community development, the nonprofit sector, and education reform. Some of his recent publications include the 2016 co-authored book Shrinking Cities, From Neighborhoods of Despair to Neighborhoods of Opportunity, and the 2015 co-authored book Qualitative Research Methods for Community Development. So let's welcome all of our panelists. If you would, thank you. I'm going to ask each of them to speak briefly, about 10 minutes, on their thoughts both of Richard Florida, the book, and urban gentrification here in Buffalo. I think that these are all issues that we're here to talk about. I won't interject, but for time, I would ask that you save questions to the end. Who would like to begin? Why don't we start over on the far right with Rob Silver?
I want to thank everybody for coming today. I don't always get an opportunity to talk about a book that someone else has written. It's very timely and deals with topics that are relevant to a number of cities, including Buffalo, even though, as I'll kind of explain, the author kind of excludes Buffalo from a lot of the analysis and a lot of the recommendations. And that might be somewhat justified, but it's also kind of a missed opportunity that I think we'll be able to talk more about as a panel. And I'm guessing that a lot of you are just now kind of learning about the book. Some have read a little bit of it, and some haven't read, a great deal of the book yet. And so I just wanted to kind of like
the microphone.
Oh, kind of too far away.
No, I think it's just coming on and off.
Oh, okay.
How about that? That's off.
Switch microphones.
Yeah. Doesn't the sound work somewhat?
No, it doesn't.
So this is not going to work.
We're not that far away.
We're not that
True.
far away, that's
Speak
true.
up instead.
So, Rob, please continue with, and if you could take a moment and discuss Richard Florida generally.
Oh, okay, well,
Yeah.
Richard Florida has done a lot of work really over the past couple of... Okay, like that.
There you go.
That works great. Well, Richard Florida is known for a lot of his work really over the past few decades looking at creative cities and making arguments that if you invest in attracting the creative class to cities, that you can really spur revitalization. And so a big part of that argument is that if cities focus on development that brings people in creative industries, whether it's computer science, or arts and entertainment, or architecture, or a number of professional fields that create supportive infrastructure for those creative industries, that you'll be able to kind of spur economic growth and development. And as a result of all the innovation and investment that those individuals attract, that it will lift the boats of everyone else in service sector jobs that support all the tastes and different types of consumer preferences and other needs of the creative class. And so it's kind of a top-down approach to doing revitalization that's really based on attracting, very energetic, young, kind of innovative entrepreneurs to a city. And I kind of emphasize the young part too as well, because there's a generational component to the creative cities model, which is that Florida, was very, key on targeting, millennials to cities as well. And we've all kind of heard variations of this before when different groups come to town and different consulting firms come around and talk about, strategies to, revitalize cities like Buffalo and also larger cities around the country like, New York and Philadelphia Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco. So this model's been around for a while, and actually Florida started talking about creative cities in Pittsburgh, and he saw that as really kind of emblematic of the creative model working. And of course he talks about this in speeches all over the country, where he kind of pitches this model to different local governments, and when he goes around and gives kind of invited lectures about how the creative model can help turn around cities. I don't know if he made it to Buffalo to do that particular speech, but he does have some Buffalo ties as well. And anyhow, along the way, he became very well known for this, and he ended up at the University of Toronto, where he is now, where he has kind of a Creative Cities Institute. And his model was heavily criticized, partly because it left a lot of groups in those creative cities behind, because that emphasis on kind of high income, knowledge industry, cohort members really didn't, pay close enough attention to the economic inequality that some of the types of growth that the creative model generated produced. And so, with the creative cities model, we saw an expansion of, service sector employment that was, paid less than a working wage and less than a, kind of an income level that would support, households, in these cities that were becoming, more expensive and more exclusive as a result of some of the regeneration that they brought about. And Florida has been pretty heavily criticized both in academic venues and in public policy forums for kind of leaving out that piece in his discussion about creative cities, and also because he's very flamboyant and he travels around and he's kind of a very good salesman for his model. He sells lots of books, and I see some people actually bought the books in this group as well. And so he's both been very successful with this approach, but it's been heavily criticized for a lot of things that it leaves out. And in a lot of ways, this new book, The New Urban Crisis, is Florida's way of maybe reconciling, with some of those criticisms, because what he points out is that he is finally acknowledging that, a lot of cities that have experienced growth and development as a result of adopting different aspects of this creative cities approach have also seen growing inequality. And that inequality both takes place within cities, where all of the telltale signs of this uneven growth are seen. Things like housing cost inflation, a lack of an emphasis on developing affordable housing, wage gaps that are expanding, and also a number of other services in communities that really have fallen behind, as this very specific population has really been the target of development. Because one of the things that is also kind of an extension of Florida's model is that the creative class that he's focusing on attracting in communities tend to be younger. They haven't established their own households. They haven't entered the childbearing ages or delayed childbearing for years. And so investments in things like schools and in services like healthcare and other supportive services that promote workforce development at all levels weren't really part of Florida's model. And so cities were really left off the hook, or given a chance to be off the hook in developing those types of services that really promote equity and mobility in their communities. And so he wrote this book partly as a response to those critiques, but also as a way of signaling to who he thought would be policymakers, in the current period, to develop policies to address some of those inequalities. And he was specifically thinking that in the last election, that the Democrats would win the presidency, and they'd be able to kind of expand upon some of the pilot programs and demonstration projects that the Obama administration had begun to initiate, where a more comprehensive approach to community development was being experimented with, or at least started to be experimented with in cities. And of course, he is surprised at the time, at the point of the election, as a lot of other people were. And when you read his book, you'll see that he actually had to rewrite, the concluding chapter and several other sections in it to try to, deal with, that new reality when the Trump administration became the administration in Washington, and when the political climate had become much more conservative and much more vocalist than he had anticipated while he was writing the book. And so, Florida makes this argument that, in essence, the creative cities model needs to be reformed in many ways to create more equity and more inclusion as urban revitalization moves forward. And he made a number of recommendations that he thought would be very important to promote more equity in creative cities. And a lot of these recommendations are things we've heard before and fall in line with a lot of progressive thoughts about economic development, at least to some extent, that have been out there for 6, 7, 8 years now. And some of the things he talked about were promoting more mixed-use development and density in cities in order to make room for more affordable housing, more services for people at all income levels, and just more access to mobility in general. And he's very critical, in fact, of many kind of local NIMBYism movements to try to slow development. And he talks about the new Luddites, and he uses all of these kind of buzzwords to really signal that he has a very high density, new development approach for cities. And the other thing, we wrap it up. Oh, okay. The other things he talks about is affordable housing, minimum wage increases, mass transit expansion. But the thing that really stands out in Florida's argument is that he's really talking about all these things in the context of what he calls superstar cities. And so, even though he's acknowledging that there's inequality, most of his recommendations focus on things that would help very large global cities like New York, San Francisco, Toronto, Los Angeles. And so the smaller cities that he originally started talking about creative class development in, like the Buffaloes and Pittsburghs and Clevelands of the world, really are kind of left out of this formula. And we can talk more about what that means in terms of some of the local approaches to promoting development that he focuses on in his conclusion, and whether or not that approach, although it might work for some cities, might actually increase inequality between cities more. It's a good place to pass the baton.
Hello, my name is Keisha Patterson. I would like to talk a little bit about my relationship with Florida and his previous work. I actually did not come to this book having read The Creative Class, or sort of being sort of aware of the criticisms necessarily of that book. I started it and it didn't seem to apply to Buffalo or my work, and so I sort of put it down. But sort of being forced to get all the way through this book, I was sort of a little bit frustrated by the fact that he enumerated the problems, especially of the urban crisis, and sort of waited until the very end and didn't give an awful lot of time to solutions. As an architect, I would like to point out that he does, even though he talks about the problems of cities, and that being sort of the problem of economy and inequality and those things, that the solutions are going to come from cities as well. I love cities, and the reason I love cities is because he points out in the book, as humans, we're social animals, and we do best when we're in groups, and it is the density and the diversity of that density that gets different ideas and different people in the same room, bunching up against each other, and on a very sort of fine-grained detail level, walking down the same sidewalk, right? And while it doesn't really talk about sort of, I think Buffalo is mentioned in the book maybe once and isn't in the index at all, we are really familiar with the problems of gentrification, racial and economic inequality, and sort of what to do about making sort of our lives here well. And I think fundamentally it becomes a question of, so what are our values, and if we want an equitable, innovative economy where people can do well, I think that he does propose some solutions that even cities like Buffalo can I also think that while gentrification is something that it's a word that I think people have a lot of emotions about, and I think that he presents it in this book in a way that while a lot of the problems of gentrification are outlined, and that there are a lot of them, displacement, being in a neighborhood that not only sort of you get displaced from, but in fact the name gets changed, and there's not only the physical but the sort of cultural erasure of the place and where you're from, and sort of connection to your community. I think that some of the solutions are, again, going to be urban, and they're going to come from cities, and I think it's really super interesting. He did have to sort of rewrite the book because of the political climate did not turn out the way he expected it to be, but I think what's more important is that one of his solutions is that the solutions are going to come from the local community, and I think that is where places like Buffalo can really feel empowered, because people here know what the problems are, and I think that we can kind of define solutions that will not necessarily translate to what he calls this sort of superstar cities like New York and LA and London. But while the type of solution might be different, I think the types of solutions may be the same, but exactly how they're implemented might be different. I think the one that sort of stood out to me in terms of solutions, and I think he sort of put it in a list with a lot of other things, was sort of tackling concentrated poverty. And I think that architects and placemakers don't necessarily think that they are part of that solution. We sort of often our businesses are sort of fee for service. A developer says we want to build something, and we say, well, it'll cost you this much, and we can do it. However, I think that placemakers do have a really important role in tackling concentrated poverty, because not only are those social and economic crises, those are urban, and by urban I mean we're talking brick and mortar, sidewalks, grass, stoops, sort of very physical problems that not only policymakers but designers have, I think, an obligation to address. So that's a little bit of my perspective.
Good morning. So my name is Rawa. Full disclosure, I did not read the book. You would have had a very handsome Aaron Bartley here, but he had a family emergency, so I'm stepping in for him. He is the executive director of Push Buffalo. I'm also going to be very honest. The name Richard Florida gives me a visceral reaction. It literally makes me want to throw up. Let me tell you why. Also, full disclosure, I hope not to offend any of you. My intention is not to offend anyone today. My intention is to just stand in my truth and the experience that I've had with Richard Florida, first as the executive director of a political activist, primarily African American, but culturally specific theater company here in Buffalo.
Robert, could you hold the microphone farther?
A little bit further, I'm talking too loud, sorry about that. And so, the reason why I say that I have a visceral reaction to Richard Florida is because when I was the executive director in 2007, philanthropic giving was misdirected now towards away from general operations and towards programs, purposely to sort of accommodate this new and creative class. Several of the foundations here locally were sending many of us, or leaders of cultural organizations, to places like Toronto, and really kind of full force behind Richard Florida. When I first found out that this book came out, I wrote a little bit of an abstract with the intention that I would write a Medium blog post or something, but I did not, because I realized I was so angry. But I'm going to read part of it to you, because some of it is kind of graphic, and I will not do that today, but I'll read to you what my initial response to this book was. Richard Florida took the genie out of the bottle, and now he wants to put it back after the devastation his ideas have brought to the urban core by accelerating gentrification in emerging markets. Over a decade ago, his book and investments in the creative class, misnomer, it should have read Investments in Privileged White College Graduate Hipster Artists whose parents supported their good intentions by paying for their rent and college loans. The slave wages these hipsters earned allowed them to pay for their hipster nightlife and fancy coffee shops. They further extracted funding that should have funded local artists of color and arts organizations. Richard Florida, blah, 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 philanthropy and city government, cut the lifeline and watched arts organizations of color languish. They absorbed our best and brightest and stole our culture and bastardized it. Changed funding of general operations to funding new programs. So now that Florida gets it, I think he should take all of his new woke book proceeds and give them to reparation projects in the urban core, specifically to be invested in frontline communities for land ownership, permanently affordable housing, and people of color creative class. Classism continues to be the real divide in America, and it's bleeding us. Racism bleeds us, and heteropatriarchy is killing us. It is the same old divide and conquer policies of past. Now that I got that off my chest, I feel a little bit better. It's how I feel, and like I said, my intention is not to offend anyone, but I've lived my life in working in frontline communities, whether it's as a cultural organization leader, whether it's dealing with issues of gentrification and community development, and really trying to find solutions that are rooted in reality, not just what sounds good or what is top down. It's got to be bottom up and top down, and somewhere in the middle, I believe, is a sweet spot. Generally, I would not say that. I am an organizer. I would have said it would have been bottom up. We don't have that kind of time. We have to work on both ends of this, because how we are extracting our natural systems and compromising it is going to cause devastation, much in the wake as we see of what's happening in places like the Caribbean with all of these different superstorms. We've got half of the country underwater, the other half on fire. We are not thinking about these issues, and how it's going to impact Buffalo is very real. We are seeing it now with how our neighborhoods are being divided, with this idea of moving back into cities, rents that are $2,000 a month, and the absolute disregard for building, whether it's through the ECIDA, whether it's the city of Buffalo, not thinking about policies that would slow down the kind of development that is displacing people. And I know it's displacing people because I live on the west side of Buffalo, and I have to every single day listen to a family, whether they're immigrant, refugee, poor white, a person of color, being displaced to other parts of the city. And so this is what I live every day. We are experiencing home prices that are doubling and quadrupling over the last couple of years. We are seeing people ramp up the rent $150, $300 a month without having done any new investments, whether it's weatherizing, doing green efficiency, or solar, dealing with issues of abatement around lead and asbestos. And in my neighborhood, what I see is homes being flipped. Buying them for a song and now selling them for $300,000. And they're actually matchbook boxes as far as I'm concerned. So all that to say, there are real solutions, but let me just talk about what I'm leading up to is that we live in a very extractive economy. Extracts our world views around consumerism and consumer mindset. Really, that is fossil fuel extraction, it is heteropatriarchy, it is capitalism. We deal with resources that are being, 5 minutes?
Please.
Okay. It's about digging, burning, and dumping. It's about exploiting workers. It's about enclosing capital in the top 1%. And it is not about democracy, it's about militarism. We can stop this, if we think about how we care about our cultural identities, about not having cultural appropriation, about how we deal with natural systems and Mother Earth, and seeing that as being sacred and valued, cooperative economics with workers. Our purpose is should be around ecological and social well-being. resources should be about regeneration meaning reduce, reuse, recycle, renew. And then thinking about our governance as being much more deeply democratic than it is. So what do we have to do? We have to stop the bad, we have to build the new, so we have to do opposition work and visionary work simultaneously, which is what I believe we're doing at Push Buffalo. We have to divest from an extractive economy and invest into this regenerative economy. And you do that through a moral compass, a filtration system that basically begins to systematically move us into the right direction. And that's how you build equity in a city. I can tell you how you do it in Buffalo in 2 minutes. He says, I've got 2 minutes, I will do that. We are a city that is designed for 600,000 people. We currently have 282,000 people. What I love about Buffalo is its people and its cultural cohesiveness and fabric, where you have not just a culture of whiteness, you have Irish communities, Italian communities, you have African American communities, Latino communities, immigrant communities. And so what you do is you invest. Every single investment should be going to those communities. Fortify our homes, making sure that we're resilient, ready, built into the infrastructure. Those are the jobs, and you pay them a living wage or higher. Family-sustaining wages is what we're advocating for. You upskill those people into the new sector economies and allow the people that want to move back into the cities to invest around us. You will have a mixed income, mixed amenity, climate-ready future city, and that is what I believe Buffalo could be.
A high school band, and we never had these problems. We were 15 and it was the 80s and all of our microphones worked, but these never seemed to work. Anyway, thank you all for the wonderful discussion. I want to open it up to questions and comments. I would ask Mary Jean, would you mind sort of taking the wireless microphone around and if we have any questions. Something that occurs to me, I'm a former assistant district attorney here in this community, and when I began in the 90s, there was a very fashionable theory called broken windows. The idea being that if policing took care of the small issues, littering, broken windows, that it would lead to a larger, more invested community that followed the law and had less crime. It was a kernel of a very good idea, but as it was regarded as a fashionable theory and applied everywhere, it led to some very undesirable things that I think we've seen in the last 20 years. The idea of prosecuting small crimes led to things like stop and frisk. And maybe that's an issue that we need to consider, that these ideas, in Richard Florida, whether you wish to agree or disagree with everything he said, I think he's identified a core truth, that a lot of the wealth that has been created by a particular creative class. Whether or not that's an idea that can be applied universally across the nation and the world in whatever city or any urban area, I think it's a different question, and any sort of theory that you embrace is going to have a downside, a deleterious consequence. That's just a thought I had. But let's open it up to questions. Yes, if you give this gentleman the microphone.
Thank you. The superstar cities are located in very desirable areas that are rife with trade. And even here in Buffalo, when the first citizens came, one of the first things about was the general store. So people live in places that are amenable to life, and they require infrastructure to support them. This is how cities work. This library is filled with books of very different types and very different sections. And people of all different types of interests come here and read those books. We don't have one type of book for everybody. We don't have equality of literature or equality of thought. We have in this country equality of opportunity. And for those who would like to see things their way and nice for everyone, bottom line is it comes down to you all paying your taxes to the degree that those things can be afforded. Now here in Buffalo, I think we need to shine our light on our many blessings and attractions. I think we ought to think really seriously in Buffalo about schools. Our schools are failing, and the products of those schools, their energy, ability, and intellects are not being developed and harnessed to create and contribute to the well-being of the city. That's what I think. And I think this woman here was very oriented to cultural work and devoted her life to it. Should be admired. But I also think she should also reflect her origins. She came here to this country because she can be free to do what she wishes. We all can be free. And that's the blessing of this community. And I think Richard Florida is a gentleman who's thinking about things and gets us talking. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anyone want to make a comment?
Yes. We have a lot of things here in Buffalo, but what we don't have is equality of opportunity. It just doesn't exist.
Mayor Brown is not.
What we don't have is equality of opportunity, and some of that is simply physical. If you can't get to your job in 20 minutes, guess what? You don't have a job.
You don't have a skateboard.
You know, you don't. And the people who can get to their jobs on public transportation in 20 minutes or less for $1.75 for you? Yeah. $2. They can spend more time with their children. They can get to work on time. They can spend more of their wages on investing in their homes. If you can't afford to live in a neighborhood where you can get to work in 20 minutes for $2, guess what? You don't have those opportunities. If you don't live within 20 minutes of the community college or the Central Public Library, you do not have an equitable opportunity. This is what's great about cities, because you can build one library and everybody can come, and there is a diversity of ideas, and I can bump into somebody who I fundamentally disagree with and have a discussion. But if you can't physically get there, you can't do it. And our landscape reinforces those inequalities. And part of that is that when, not even this sort of creative class, even this 1%, has walled themselves off in neighborhoods, and they reinforce their wealth by having access to getting to work in 20 minutes
Can
for $2.
One of the things that people have been talking about, why does this, what is, I don't know. I'm turning it down, I'm sorry.
Oh, there you go.
The HQ2, Amazon's second headquarters, we've all seen about, all of this talk about it. And if you look at the criteria that they say, one of the primary things that they say that they want in any city is public transportation. So let's talk a little bit about public transportation in Buffalo and how that affects an urban area. And Robert, I'd be interested to hear what you think about that.
Well, about the HQ2 or just public transit?
Generally.
Well, I mean, having transit access to all the resources that people need to kind of get a leg up in life is kind of a core theme that planners talk about, that Florida talks about in his book to some extent, and that really is kind of central to being able to access resources. And so what is public transit? Well, if you have a walkable city, it's living close to the library, quality schools, the job site, healthcare institutions where you can get to the doctor and then get back to work on time, daycare for your children, and all the other kind of services that people need access to, including a good grocery store and all the retail kind of needs that people need to meet their, and also parks, I can't leave that out too, but all the things that you need to generate a quality of life in a community. And so there are a lot of transit inequalities in cities around the country, and Buffalo has many of those same issues. Whether people can afford, well, right, having transit routes, whether they're bus routes that connect all the neighborhoods to all of those resources, and just having a quality public transportation system.
You don't think we do?
I don't think Buffalo does have the level of public transit access that would give every neighborhood.
We have 275,000 people. We don't need a transit system for 7 million. We
If
have
well,
NFTA here. They have buses every part of the city.
But one of the
They
big
go out to the
problems.
malls. They go all
Let
over.
him answer.
But one of the big problems with NFTA is just the fare rates. And they're not affordable for a lot of people at lower income levels.
Oh,
And
really?
those folks also
That's you?
live furthest away.
Let's not do this. Let's not heckle. We're going to stop that, or I'm going to have to ask you to I think a big issue with the transit is the issue of sprawl. Although we have a city designed, as Rawa said, for 600,000 people, only 220,000 people live in it, but yet we have a county of 1 million. So that's a big public transit challenge when you have everyone moving out and demanding a city that where everybody gets around by car. You know, I consider myself a new urbanist, but I drive my car everywhere just like everybody else. I'm usually alone. I'm part of the problem. But let's move on to another question. Are there other questions here?
My name is Ken. I want to thank everybody for their time. To this woman on the end, I'm sorry that can't pronounce your name.
Rawa.
Rawa. You were talking about bottom-up organizing and top-down.
Policy change.
What was it?
Policy change.
Policy change. Thanks. As an organizer, how does for PUSH, I think, yeah, how does the PUSH organization feel that the foundations and the intellectual power of the colleges in the area are being supportive of the work that PUSH is doing?
I can speak loud. I would say that not enough, but I think more and more we have such tremendous knowledge, so many amazing universities that they're starting to kind of not be so insular and really begin to do a lot of their research and a lot of their work in collaboration with community-based organizations, because I think that they see that it would be better for their students to have real hands-on experience, but also solving real problems in real time.
Gentleman over here.
Thank you. I haven't had a chance to read the book, so I'm actually interested in some of the panelists speaking to particular solutions that Florida had about reversing the issues of gentrification that were caused by catering to the creative class, and and particularly if he doesn't mention the issues of Buffalo, how you guys might address that issue with Buffalo, particularly since we have an extremely segregated landscape, both racially and class-wise. And so that creates a situation where people who are very low income don't have political control to protect their districts. That becomes the districts within which gentrification starts first, as opposed to other areas that have high incomes, and they have political representation that will allow them to resist such things. We see this happening in Elmwood Village, where there's resistance to development, but we don't see this in the Fruit Belt and Buffalo's East Side. And so I'm wondering if there are ways that Florida suggests how the gentrification patterns that negatively impacted these low-income areas previously could be changed now that he recognizes that it's a negative force. And if he doesn't address that, what ways might you suggest that Buffalo goes about thinking about both protecting these lower-income areas and perhaps integrating them with mixed income areas and mixed use types of productivity? Thank you.
Before the panelists comment on that, I would just say that Richard Florida's book mentions Buffalo several times, but only in the context of the fact that it's one of the most statistically segregated cities as it relates to race and poverty and class. So it's only mentioned negatively in that particular regard. But that's an excellent question. And who wants to take it first?
There's a few false solutions that will get us there to the real solution eventually. Part of that is inclusionary zoning, meaning all these developers get all kinds of tax breaks. For example, Nick Sinatra just got $600,000 for redeveloping the Great Era Pierce building. That means he's not going to be paying taxes for many, many years, which is a lot of years, when this gentleman can afford to buy in 1 month $10 million worth of property. So should he really receive these tax breaks because he fits the criteria through the IDA agency, which is a welfare program as far as I'm concerned, when in reality, those kinds of investments are not going to like concentrated poverty neighborhoods that could help to build the infrastructure that could put people to jobs without any real community benefits assigned to the $600,000 tax break around first source hiring. What are the other procurement and other kinds of community benefits that come along with that? And what are the actual permanent jobs? Not even, because construction is a very not permanent position, right? So once the project is done, they pretty much let everybody go and they're back on being unemployed. What are the real permanent jobs long term? We need to think and have a paradigm shift of our thinking. Where does that look like, not just like 18 months from now, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now? Are we setting ourselves up? I'm not saying don't give money to developers. I'm not saying don't give money for opportunities. What I'm saying is, what are the real community benefits, or are we further enclosing that wealth back to the top 1%? And I will argue to say that we do not have great resources in this city, especially in concentrated neighborhoods, whether they be white or black or people of color or whoever. What we're seeing is, since 2008, with all this billion-dollar investment coming from the state, all these developers coming here and buying up all this land, which is mostly wealthy families that have, already bought up Chicago and California and the Bay Area. And what we are seeing is childhood poverty is actually on the rise. It was less than 50% pre-2008. Now we have to 69% of Asian children in Erie County go to bed hungry, 58% of African American children, 57% of Latino children, and 26% of white children going to bed hungry. This is a moral question and a moral obligation that goes much further. So we need to be able to scratch the surface and no longer pay lip service to pull yourself up by the bootstraps when we really literally don't have 2 pennies to rub together in certain communities.
So just for the sake of clarity, are you saying that that Florida suggested that we demand more for the kinds of incentives, or is that your suggestion?
No, it's my suggestion.
Okay.
My suggestion is you have to attach community benefits agreements to anybody that you're giving tax breaks to, right? Because this is technically our tax dollars. We spend $8 billion a year giving money to IDAs. Where are the community benefits? Because I do not see them in Buffalo. I also believe that solutions in Buffalo are not going to be New York City solutions. They're not going to be upstate solutions. Are going to look different. For example, in the city of Buffalo, I wouldn't even recommend, the city of Seattle, I would not recommend inclusionary zoning. That ship has sailed. There is no way that you can now build inclusionary zoning into the city of Seattle because there's no more properties. And everywhere you go in Seattle, you see homelessness that has been exasperated. It's nothing but tent city under every single highway.
I think that Florida did not address this sufficiently. The thing is, as a designer, as an architect, I have seen models that really work well for this. And not to bring this into the healthcare debate, but a lot of times people talk about the health insurance companies making a lot of money in between the health consumer and the health provider. And I think the developers are very much in that very same bubble between placemakers and the consumers of place, the people who live there. There are models to circumvent that. One of which, and I have been I've been researching this and wanting to do this in Buffalo for so long, is co-housing, where you have a community of people who are going to live there, who can, as a group, get to the designers, the architects, the land acquisition, the legal, to make a community where they want, with the amenities they want, at an affordable price. And there are plenty of designers that would love to do this and are saying, hey, can I get 10 people? Up until very recently, you had to have 35 feet to build, 40 feet to build a new house on an empty lot in Buffalo. Now, all of the lots were drawn in the 1800s were 25 to 30 feet, which meant to build one new house, you had to buy 6 lots. I've done the math. That meant that if I, wanting a house that's affordable, that fits my needs and my family, as the consumer, couldn't do it. But a developer could, because they could buy 6 lots together. And it wasn't until very recently that has been changed. And then, that's one model. There are other models from Northern Europe, Denmark, Sweden. They have lots of co-housing. It works relatively well. Since then, recently, they've started a model where the city is holding property, instead of selling it at a profit, which is the model that our city has decided to take. They've decided to instead connect people who need housing with designers to develop housing that would work for them in their community. They subsidize the homeowner and the designer, and then they get a house, a property that is in a location, in a community that somebody wants to live in, and it's not speculative at all. And guess who gets that tax break? The people who are interested in living there and building the community and are there to put in the street trees and the, you know, and shovel the snow, whereas developers are putting money in, and honestly, they're just putting it there to park it. They're not necessarily interested in anything other than the tax breaks and a place to park their money. I don't necessarily see gentrification as a bad thing, but I think when, you know, if it's a duck, call it a duck. In neighborhoods that have been resisting development, I do sometimes wonder about their motivations when they say, well, it's not historical or it doesn't fit scale or these things, when often they're just keeping the rents on their carriage houses high by not, you know, making there be more units. The things that are great about Buffalo are that, you know, we do have beautiful buildings and we do have the space for this infrastructure, and we do have sort of a logical city grid, right? And we've got active, interesting, exciting, you know, people who are excited about Buffalo. But when we have developers sort of in this middle ground, and honestly, I think everybody knows who this is. I saw a poster for development, and I don't care if the building was ugly, I don't care if it was out of scale, but on every poster, on every rendering, they had Black people, people in families, arty people. You know, actually somebody asked me to model. They're like, would you sit in a coffee shop and I'll take a picture? And I was like, no, because no. When in fact, first of all, they didn't have any 3-bedroom apartments, so I don't know why they had people pushing strollers in front of the development. The rents were something like $2,000 or $1.50 a square foot, and because, you know, people of color in this community make half of what white people do, they really didn't expect any Black people to go there. And I think what's very frustrating for people who are interested is trying to pitch it to us in a way that is just not even accurate. I think that people in this community have to be aware that that's what's going on, and that's what our tax dollars are going to, and we have an opportunity to change that policy. Pass the mic.
No, it's a great question, and you know, again, Florida didn't make a lot of recommendations that were really specific to Buffalo, and the ones about, you know, kind of adding affordable housing into the equation when neighborhoods revitalize was really kind of very skeletal in a way. It was an idea that was thrown out there and suggested that in the current kind of, you know, political environment, that's something that big cities need to do on their own. And so the question is, well, what do medium-sized and small cities do? And one of the things that Florida doesn't talk about, but that we see happening in places like Buffalo, is a lot of discussion about all the things that we just talked about there, community benefits agreements, these co-housing options, and also, you know, things like the community land trust, which is a big discussion going on in the Fruit Belt neighborhood and some other neighborhoods in Buffalo. And I was actually, you know, in that neighborhood about a week and a half ago doing some work on a project I'm doing with the university. And, you know, there were people visiting from Brooklyn who were actually trying to learn about that approach from the people who were designing it in Buffalo. And so there's a lot of kind of education that we can provide, because we're dealing with a different scale and also a different stage of revitalization, or even some stalled revitalization, and have to consider some of these other more grassroots-oriented options to get at the same thing, which is to make sure that, you know, redevelopment happens in a balanced way, where there's affordable housing mixed in with market rate housing, and, you know, everybody in the community gets a shot at all the new resources that are getting clustered in certain areas. And so that's another important point.
One last question, the lady in the back.
I live in art space, and it's a community of artists. And my question is, what can we do as a community to change the ethnic, how can I say,
Segregation.
pricing of the rent and stuff? I mean, when I moved in art space, it was affordable. Now that all these lofts and stuff are popping up around us, I'm in fear of being pushed out of the city and nowhere to stay. I mean, you know, it's just, what could we do as a community to change these things? I mean, it's evident. I mean, 2,000 for rent, 1,500, you know, compared to $600 a month. I mean, what can we do as a community?
I think part of it is sharing of knowledge. We know what's coming. The reality is other cities like Chicago, all the big cities up and down each coast have experienced this. We are trying to build in the policies that are necessary because wages are not increasing at the rate of, you know, inflation at this moment, right? And a lot of it is speculation. A lot of it is, I mean, for example, the in-Ram City auction just happened. They were selling lots for $40,000 that would have sold for $1,000 5 years ago, I promise you. And most of those folks that are coming in speculating also are not from Buffalo. They're coming from Brooklyn, parts of New York City. You know, we're talking about we do the research on this stuff, and the research continues to say that Buffalo's biggest issue is inequality across race, gender, class, you name it. That's the #1 issue. We have disinvestment for 50 years has gut out our communities. What we have is concentration of poverty that has given us across every single social determinant of health, whether it's you know, our education system. We see the Buffalo public schools are failing our kids. When you look at our health outcomes across all of these, we're not faring well. And at the same time, we now have to deal with this issue of speculation and the land grab that's happening in Buffalo that is further exasperating these pernicious old policies that have been in place, whether they're redlining, whether it's, you know, segregation, whether it's racism, whether it's just, you know, jobs that left us because industry left decades ago. We're working service sector jobs that don't pay very well. A lot of us are the working poor. What do we do about it? Honestly, I think it's not the end-all be-all solutions, but we do have to try to pass some kind of inclusionary zoning policy at the city level. That is a fight that's happening. Call your elected officials. They're stalling, as far as I'm concerned. It's going to ECIDA meetings and other IDA meetings where they're giving out all of these tax breaks. We need to come out in numbers. We have to organize. We have to advocate for policies that are going to keep affordability built into whatever policies are being created, which currently do not exist. I believe in mixed income, mixed amenity neighborhoods. I believe in biodiversity. I believe in all of these things. I think that is what's going to make us resilient and climate ready for all the different disruptions. I also feel that's the way to put people to work is through, you know, we have a combined sewer overflow problem. We can build it by putting in resilient features like around rain gardens, bioswales, that kind of stuff.
Ro, I want to give, we're out of time, but before we go, I want to give each of our other two panelists a couple minutes to make a final comment.
Okay. So the final comment that I'm going to make, it's a little bit personal, right? So I read this book while I was taking transit to work in Pittsburgh. I essentially gave up on Buffalo. And part of that reason was that I simply couldn't afford rent on my income, and I am highly trained and all those things. And I think that a lot of people here said, well, we're going to miss you. And, you know, I was here for 20 years, and if you're going to miss me so much, Could have done something sooner. One of the problems that, one of the solutions I think is going to be having women and people of color and people who are low income and from Buffalo at the table in the placemaking process of making Buffalo. There are about 425 African American women who are architects in the country. Buffalo had two, I moved. And it's funny, but if I'm the only one who's thinking these thoughts, then I can't be loud enough, you know. And so, you know, I'm going to say that that is inclusion from, you know, just having the access to know that that's how cities are made. And so that's my sort of last thought. I think that while this book doesn't give it all the answers, I think it raises some important questions, and it's sort of worth seeing his perspective just to sort of start thinking about cities as not only the problem, but cities as being a solution as well.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I would add is that, you know, when you get to the end of the book, you know, Florida kind of throws his hands up in despair and says that the city should kind of pursue things on their own, and there should be this, you know, expansion of home rule, and cities should kind of figure out ways out of this, you know, inequality problem that's been created over time, really as a product of a lot of policies that aren't just city-based policies, but investments and incentives that come from the federal and the state and the county and the local level that produce all of these development patterns that result in the kind of inequality that we see in cities today, or the lack of investment as well. And I mean, that's not really a realistic kind of answer to give the cities, because, you know, when we think about how we fund education, it's not a local process anymore. A lot of education money comes from the state level. And when we think about how we deal with affordable housing in the United States, there are federal housing programs, there are, you know, tax incentives at the state and federal and local level that help developers to, you know, be able to build housing that's affordable to people at all income levels. And when you look at every policy, you know, across the board, including things like workforce development, you know, employment policies, wage policies, there are local parts to that, but there's definitely a national and a state level dialogue that has to happen. And I think, you know, for, you know, Florida to kind of just surrender everything to the local level is not really a real sustainable answer, because every city has a different level of resources. And that's what I was kind of getting at, is that if every city has to go it on its own, then some are going to do better than others, and it's usually the ones that are better off to begin with. And so you can't really solve the inequality problem without thinking about it, you know, at all levels of government. And just because things are not real amenable to that today doesn't mean that that's not something to continue to kind of have dialogue about for the future.
All right, well, before we wrap up and I ask you to give a round of applause to our panel, I just want to tell all of you that we're on hiatus. The Chairman's Book Club is on hiatus until March of 2018, at which time Karen King, the Executive Director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women, will be guest hosting the Chairman's Book Club for Women's History Month. She will be discussing a wonderful book called Men Explain Things to Me by Rebecca Solnit. I don't know if the interaction between men and women is in any way in the news these days, but it might be relevant then. So that said, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for their time and what I think was a wonderful discussion.